Today we're going to talk about gauge. Getting the right gauge is such an essential part of almost any knit or crochet project that many of you groan at the thought of making a gauge swatch. I guess you could say that gauge is like eating your vegetables when all you really want is chocolate. Let's start with what gauge means. Gauge is the number of stitches and rows that you are getting to the inch, and if your gauge isn't the same as your pattern, your project will end up a different size. This means garments that don't fit, not having enough yarn, and many other problems. We can't all knit or crochet with the same size needle or hook to get the same gauge because we don't all knit with the same tension. The best thing to do is make a gauge swatch, changing needles as necessary to obtain the needed gauge. First, try the needle size called for in the pattern. If you know that you knit loose, start with a size smaller. If you know that you're a tight knitter, go up a size. But you can't always assume anything since we don't know if the designer's tension is loose or tight and whether or not they've allowed for that. I'm going to focus on knitted gauge swatches. Crochet gauge tends to be less standardized in terms of size and stitches, but the principle is the same. First, we'll start with the wrong way to make a gauge swatch. Many instructions, tutorials, and well-known instructors will teach this, but I'm going to show you why this is a great way to wind up not getting the right gauge. We're going to use a gauge of 9 stitches by 12 rows in stockinette stitch for our example. You'll cast on 9 stitches, work for 12 rows, and see if the square measures 4 inches by 4 inches. The square measures 4 inches by 4 inches, so our gauge must be perfect, right? Not so fast. To make a better gauge swatch, cast on more stitches. It is best if you cast on enough stitches so you have extra stitches on either side of the 4 inches you are measuring. With this swatch, we have 9 stitches in 12 rows, surrounded by a couple of rows of garter stitch on the bottom and the top, and extra stitches on the side. The garter helps our swatch from rolling, but is not necessary. We could have just cast on 14 to 16 stitches and worked this swatch entirely in stockinette. I then lay down my swatch gauge and count how many stitches are in 4 inches. I am getting 8 stitches over 4 inches. It doesn't hurt to measure in different areas since tension isn't always a perfect thing. These swatches were knit on the same size needle. The 4-inch square makes me think I'm getting 9 stitches to 4 inches, but I'm actually only getting 8. The reason the 4x4 square method will fool you is because the edge stitches do not lay flat and roll to the side. The difference this 1 stitch difference makes can be very significant. Let's say this swatch was for a sweater and you plan on making a finished chest size of 40 inches. 9 stitches over 4 inches, or 2.25 stitches to the inch, so you would cast on 90 stitches. If you're actually getting 8 stitches over 4 inches, or 2 stitches to the inch, the sweater will turn out 45 inches around. That's 5 inches larger. What a difference a 1/4 stitch to the inch can make. And it isn't just the chest size that grows. The sleeves, the neck, everything will turn out much larger and not fat. If it had gone the other way and our gauge was too tight, we'd run the risk of making a sweater that is way too small. A gauge of 10 over 4 instead of 9 over 4 inches would shrink this 40-inch sweater into a size 36. I've intentionally used chunky yarns for this example. The result is much more obvious, but even with smaller yarns, it can still result in your project not turning out the size that you intend. Why 4 inches when everything pretty much boils down to the number of stitches in 1 inch? This was a pet peeve of Mom's. She remembers when stitch gauge was always given over 1 inch because it really boils down to that anyway. But you cannot measure just 1 inch. I mean, how do you measure 1/4 of an inch? In a stitch, it's just, you can't do it. You need to measure over a larger area, be it 4 inches, 6 inches, or even 10 inches. Count the stitches, divide by the number of inches, and voila, there is your stitch gauge. With chunky yarns like this, measuring over a larger area is really better and will give you a more accurate gauge. If I were guessing the reason why 4 inches, since 4 inches is roughly the equivalent of 10 centimeters, well, that makes sense in my mind. Metric people tend to work in groups of 10, and it conveniently converts to almost exactly 4 inches for us American folk nicely. So what do you do if your gauge is off? Too many stitches to the inch? You are knitting tighter and need to try a larger needle. Not enough stitches to the inch? You are knitting looser and need to try a smaller needle. And there is no such thing as knitting perfectly to tension. Whose tension? If I chose to write a pattern and list the needle size that I used, I can guarantee that few of you would have perfect tension as compared to mine, and that I'm a really loose knitter. I standardize the needle size recommendation for my patterns for a more average tension, but not all designers do that, so beware. Are gauge swatches always worked in stockinette? Yarn labels always give gauge in stockinette, but not patterns. Gauge is usually given over stockinette stitch, but not always. The swatch needs to be worked in the stitch pattern as given in the gauge information in your pattern. What about row gauge? Rows to the inch are usually not so important because most projects knit to a given measurement rather than to a specified number of rows. There may be some instances, such as charted designs, where you may need to take this into consideration, but this is not very common. Differences in row gauge are more likely to affect the amount of yarn needed than anything. Gauge swatches are not foolproof. Even the most perfect swatch can give you a false sense of security. Once you get your project started, stop and see if it's indeed turning out the size it is supposed to. If not, you may have a gauge issue. Check it on your project in multiple places and see what you get. Using different needles on your project than your gauge swatch can also make a difference. And maybe it's just the rhythm you develop as you get settled into your project that differs from that when you made your swatch, and that can affect your tension too. Despite this, making a swatch is not a waste of time. It is still the best indicator of what needle size you should use, and at least gives you a running start in the right direction. Now that I hopefully have everyone believing in the importance of gauge, it's time for another fun giveaway. Today, one lucky viewer will win one of these fabulous swatch gauges. These are the best gauges I've seen yet. They have these little cloth feet that hold your swatch in place, making it so much easier to count. But wait, there's more. In addition to the swatch gauge, you will also win a nifty wrist ruler. I cannot tell you how many times mine has come in handy. Plus, they're really cool to wear. Simply leave a comment on today's blog post at news.swagknit.com. Tell us what color of wrist ruler you'd like to win. You have until 8 a.m. tomorrow.